Thank you, Birgit, very much for invitation to give a lecture on New Age in Costa Rica. But in reality, I choose very difficult topic, extremely difficult topic, and I will concentrate mainly on examples in Latvia. So let us it's no fun. The New Age is usually perceived as combination of various beliefs, mishmash of eclectic elements from all metaphysical traditions, self-help, psychology, and alternative medicine. In various other definitions, it is conceived as a culture of positive thinking or a new holistic worldview which unifies science and religion. Majority of authors emphasize sharp opposition in which this form of spirituality stands against both reductionist Cartesian rationality and traditional religiosity and its institutions. New Age subjects are often described as spiritual but not religious, suggesting a widespread attitude towards life in which religion is not understood as the most valuable tool for spiritual development. It is viewed as spirituality of self-authority, obsessed with self-realization through spiritual search, psychological techniques, and market acquisition. The interest in environmental issues, meditation, yoga, or astrology, frequent jargon taken from quantum mechanics, gurus, and spiritual teachers, the absence of fixed organizational structures, as well as persistent idea of upcoming global change, further complicate the already cluttered and confusing New Age image. Soviet New Age is even more problematic concept for which it is difficult to find an ambiguous definition. In different regions of the USSR, its expressions had different historical, regional, and cultural modification. And in my lecture, I will illustrate the Soviet New Age in the Baltic area, mainly in Latvia. As you know, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were occupied for the second time after the World War II and became part of the USSR for half a century. Despite the fact that these three Baltic states were a part of the USSR, the post-war social, cultural, and economic processes, to a large extent, were much closer and more similar to those that took place in Soviet satellite countries, such as Czechoslovakia and Hungary, than in the Soviet republics. The policy pursued by the Soviet system, including the religious policy, in the occupied Baltic states was much more tolerant than in other republics. Undoubtedly, the totalitarian system was a brutal destroyer of all previous cultural heritage, traditions, and freedom. The religious persecutions carried out, the restrictions faced by all religious communities, and physical terror were an unprecedented fact in the historical memory of society. However, the Baltic society never experienced the religious persecution and terror of the 1920s and 1930s, encountered by the so-called old Soviet republics. Thereby, to a larger extent, the religious and cultural traditions, ethnic mentality, sense of freedom, and a more efficient economic environment were preserved. Therefore, when carrying out research on the Soviet New Age, the heterogeneity and diversity of the regions must be acknowledged to avoid superficial simplifications. Official religious freedom was declared by the Soviet Constitution, but the reality was different. The second half of the 1950s, physical terror was replaced by more sophisticated methods of emotional and psychological terror, creating the phenomenon of double Soviet social life, promoting secularization and the privatization of religious life and traditional practices. The ideology of communism undoubtedly weakened religion, its institutional and official forms. But at the same time, it divided the social life of individuals into two parts: an official, visible, public, and legal environment controlled by the state, and the informal, hidden, private, illegal environment of individuals, which often had its own small-scale networks. So, in different regions of the USSR, expressions of the Soviet New Age had different historical, regional, and cultural modifications. However, we can find a common ground. The paradox of the Soviet New Age. It grew out in the dynamic relationship between official, visible life and informal, visible life. And I would like to stress that the development of the Soviet New Age was influenced by the religious policy of the USSR. The Soviet policy of religions was implemented in the form of ideological atheism. Alongside the legislative means the USSR employed against religion, the militant atheism was used to combat religion at first. Later, we can speak about the period of atheistic propaganda and the period of atheistic education. And finally, the criticism of religion turns out to be linked with the propaganda of the scientific worldview. And the concept of scientific atheism appeared in the official discourse. The introduction of scientific atheism is explained by Stepanova as a transformation of Soviet atheism from militant to scientific, considering the transition from philosophical critique of religion to practical politics, aimed at expunging not only religious institutions, but also the daily expressions of religious beliefs. The scientific atheism became an important factor in educational and cultural policy, an element of the Soviet way of life. The need to prepare professionals in the field of not only atheism, but also in the history of religion. Several resolutions were adopted, and they had an ambivalent meaning. On the one hand, they aimed the party organs at increasing pressure on religious organizations and contributed to the emergence of propaganda literature. And at the same time, they made it possible for scholars of religion to publish their works, which was extremely difficult in previous years. In 1964, the discipline, scientific atheism, was introduced in all universities. An important place in the ideological and theoretical content of atheistic propaganda belongs to the natural scientific criticism of religion. After spending decades limiting activities of the religious institutions, mainly Christian churches, communists met a new problem: spiritual life outside of religious institutions under their control. As Smolkina explains, I quote, "The ideological establishment no longer saw religion as a problem primarily because it was a political enemy or even a lying ideology. Instead, religion was now understood above all as a spiritual problem. The ideological establishment began to focus on the spiritual development of Soviet society, and so the production of the socialist way of life, социалистический образ жизни, after the final battleground for the Soviet soul, because it assumed that the political and ideological battles had already been won." We can look at the Soviet spirituality as forming a new Soviet model of spiritual life after 1964, when the Soviet regime began to set values, rules, and behavior and new rights, which had to characterize all life cycles of the Soviet man, from birth to the death. And this model, of course, was not developed in an empty space, but used all the results of previous atheistic work. The goal of the creators of the Soviet spirituality was the development of a system of ideological socialization that included Soviet values through a system of atheist, ethical, aesthetic, international, and patriotic upbringing. Even as this system became more expensive and complex, however, there was little to indicate that it produced atheist or communist conviction. The first attempt by communists to transform society created a phenomenon of informal and hidden religious life. The parallel life is the main constitutive element of the Soviet spirituality. You can see in the picture in one picture, which is on the left, you can see weddings as a state institution, and on the second picture you see the wedding in the church. And my parents and my generation did like that. Firstly, they go to official state bureau of registration, and after some days, or even at the same day, they went to the church. So the life was composed from two parts. And this parallel life is the main constitutive element of the Soviet spirituality. From one side, as the memories of those who experienced the Soviet spirituality, including me, reveal they formally followed Soviet ideological norms and rituals and formed the language of Soviet ideology in public. However, this did not mean that the Soviet standard of living deeply affected their spiritual life, often determined by a completely different worldview. In all its often brutal struggles, atheism had failed to destroy neither religion nor spiritual life. Thus, the implementers of the new dogma and rituals has to replace the previous religious traditions. However, the religious traditions turned out to be stronger than atheist supports to free up space for the new Soviet spiritual life. Behind the showcase of invented the Soviet model of spiritual life was spontaneous and passionate new spiritual quest. The sheltered life on the other side of the showcase allowed this quest to be surprisingly free at times. From one side, we can observe some limits, borders imposed by the scientific atheism on the spiritual quest. From the other side, we can notice even stimulating effects. I suppose we can agree that New Age concepts are rooted in the Western interpretation of the Eastern religions, along with the political and cultural processes in the West. There was interest in the East within the USSR too. Undoubtedly, the political interests of the USSR in the East created preconditions for the study of Eastern culture, including the Eastern religions. The USSR foreign policy in relations with India in the 60s and 80s permitted extensive cultural ties between both countries. And in that focus on Indian culture began after an impressive exhibition dedicated to India in 1963 in Moscow. Exhibitions on Indian literature had already taken place in the USSR, however, this exhibition was much more ambitious. The interest in Indian literature among the Soviet intellectuals, especially the writers, gradually contributed to the study of Indian religions too. Unlike Christian churches, it might seem that Soviet authorities considered the fascination with Eastern ideas to be less harmful. However, this interest in the East was also strictly limited, and it was not advisable to exceed the boundaries set by the regime. An example from Latvia. As we know, from 65 to 77 was the golden age of Indo-Soviet relations. They made strong impact on intellectual and cultural life in the USSR. In Latvia, an important role in establishing contacts directly with India was played by the Friends of India section of the Latvian Society for Foreign Friendship and Cultural Relations, led by people's poet, Narodnaya poetessa, Mirza Tempe, a member of Communist Party. Her significance is in strengthening cultural ties between India and Latvia is evidenced by the fact that in 1972 she received a honorary doctorate in literature from the Visva-Bharati University, founded by Rabindranath Tagore. Tempe tried to be loyal to the Soviet regime and respect its ideological dogmas. But like for many at the time, there was a hidden side of her life. This part of her life included several elements that imitated Indian spiritual practices. For example, there was an altar with a portrait of Vivekananda in the center. As Tempe contemporaries stated many years later, there were books about India in various languages, from descriptions of lives of Indian saints, Indian philosophy, and Indian history to Rabindranath Tagore poetry, also known. The brightest roses and carnations were always bloomed in this corner. Candles were lit during the celebrations, and the poet burned incense sticks on the table. We can assume that Tempe also had other self-created rituals. It cannot be denied that she had an interest in Indian religions before the Soviet occupation. It is significant that in interwar period, Latvian society was well informed about American esotericism, Atkinson. who attributed his essays to Indian mystic Ramacharaka. His works were regularly published in the most popular journal in the interval period at Kulka, Free Time. And the headlines of the articles provide an understanding on what it was that attracted the readers to the teachings of Ramacharaka. So titles are Life After Death. This work was published in several parts, starting from November of 1975. The next title, Psychic Healing, published in 10 parts, starting from October 1936. And we can notice regularity of publication. An important point is that the interwar period increased interest in yoga, and its practice gradually began to take off. Familiarity with the teachings of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda facilitated the commencement of the practice of yoga. Even though interest in yoga had already been noted in the late 19th century, it became more popular in 1920s when the Latvian Society of Parapsychology was created. One of the most active practitioners of yoga was Harris Dickens, who corresponded regularly with a number of yoga teachers. The most fruitful collaboration developed with Yogendra's Yoga Institute as Dickens became its official representative in Europe. It is known that he was also in contact with Shivananda Divine Life Society. And in fact, the 79 full members of the society were active in the Latvian Yoga Society, indicates how widely yoga was practiced in Latvia in the early 1940s. I would like to explain that Harris Dickman is quite well known in the world because he left Latvia during the Second World War and continued his yoga practices and yoga teaching abroad. He is quite known in the West with different spelling of his surname. Under the Soviet regime, the open practice of yoga in groups would have inevitably resulted in persecution, which is why the practice of yoga was possible only individually. Evidence can be found in the reconciliation of those who had been repressed, that yoga were practiced by individuals even in Stalin's camps in Siberia, as it helped in maintaining their mental health and health. What were the sources of the information on the Eastern religions? We can return again to Mirza Kempe. Because of good inter-Soviet relations, Kempe received literature published in India that were sent to here through the Embassy of India in Moscow, including religious texts. Working as consultant in the Writers' Union, she familiarized young writers who gathered around here with the presents from India. Thus, from the end of the 60s, the brochures of the Satya Sai Baba movement began circulating among the younger generation of poets, or the so-called Kempe's children and their friends. Thus, architect Maya Groto set up a group to study Satya Sai Baba works that had to work in secret under the Soviet regime. The group included writer Alice Eka, author of philosophical fairy tales, and poet Mirza Bendika. Her intensive spiritual search resulted in Latvian translation of Bhagavad Gita, whose fragments were published in 1994, already after her death. Bendrupe's passion for India philosophical teachings is evident in her fairy tale book, The Most Beautiful Garden, and her meditative poetry. In the 60s and 70s, Sai Baba books were reproduced by a typewriter and circulated among trusted people. In the early 80s, the restrictions in terms of receiving literature from abroad eased. For example, in 1983 and 1984, Satya Sai Baba books were brought from Germany by Latvian immigrant Rasma Rosen, and as a result, a new New Age group emerged in Latvia. What attracted these people to Sai Baba ideas? One answer to this question can be found in an interview with a former member of this movement. I quote, "I realized that Latvian culture is much more deeper than its external manifestations. Therefore, Sai Baba's advice that everyone should develop their own culture is essential. I realized that Sai Baba also helps me understand the Latvians' roots more deeply, to overcome the sometimes popularized outward national naivety. Sai Baba teaches us to see more clearly, awakens us." End quote. The reflection on the closeness between Indian and Latvian culture, and the related encouragement to focus on in-depth studies of both cultures, was characteristic of several young poets brought up by Kempe. Imants Ziedonis, one of the most popular Latvian poets, I would like to say even contemporary classic. He already passed away and really is considered a classic of modern Latvian literature. At the turn of 20th and 21st century, Imants Ziedonis was among them, and his poem, On Milk, Poema par pienu, was recited at state events, school concerts, radio, and television. It can be said that this work was recognized as representing the Soviet spirituality. Nevertheless, only a few know that Ziedonis was deeply influenced by Upanishads and other religious texts by Indian gurus. According to unverified information, Imants Ziedonis also has been associated with a group of Sai Baba's followers for some time. In the poem, he also referred to Vedic myths. As the Indologist Victor Silbulis has argued, the poem contains references to Yagan Mata, Mother of the World, or Shakti, power, feminine cosmic energy. References to Indian religious texts are so hidden in the poem that they form a maze of different connotations for readers to decode. Significantly, one of the first who spoke publicly about yoga was Imants Ziedonis. He mentioned yoga in his travel notes about Altai, published in 1964. We have to take into consideration that Altai was considered a sacred place by followers of the earth. Ziedonis was fascinated with yoga while studying in Moscow at the higher literature program from 62 to 63. Although Ziedonis saw in yoga, first of all, a way to develop a person's physical abilities, he was also among the few who tried to show the connection of yoga with cosmic processes. As he wrote, I am quoting, "For the first time, I feel that breathing is the most beautiful process of life, not just physiological." The popularity of yoga grew even faster after the documentary Indian Yogis Who Are They in this yogic tourney was shown in Latvia in 71 with great success. The newspapers mentioned that this movie reveals the veil of mystery and supernaturalism that has covered the art of yoga for many centuries. It will tell Soviet cinema viewers what is truly valuable and useful in the yoga system. Yoga became a trendy word and hobby for hundreds of Soviet people in a relatively short time. Even reading the Latvian fiction of the 70s, very often there is a character practicing yoga. Here is how such a personality was described in one of their famous novels of the time, written by Zygmunt Sklinch. I quote, "Zelma," it's the name of a lady, "Zelma was able to talk about the latest pop music and the use of lasers in medicine, Native American culinary and energy perspectives. She is not entangled in art history, was familiar with international film scandals, followed publications on UFOs, had read books on yoga, astrology, hypnosis, palmistry, etc." End quote. We can also read more serious references to yoga in interviews with actors or other well-known public figures in the 70s and 80s, especially at the end of the 1980s. In the 70s, illustrated magazines featured specialized yoga exercises such as yoga exercises for women or exercises for good mood. Librarians testified that, for example, the magazine India was like a filter. Readers cut out everything to do with yoga exercises. In 1981, the book Yoga for Mothers and Children, translated from German, was published, which quickly became a guide for everyone interested in learning Hatha yoga asanas. With the publication of this book, public interest in yoga grew even more. According to editorial column of the magazine's Vaiksne in 1988, officials of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Soviet Latvia had predicted that the ninth wave of magazine circulation growth is expected if mass media publish materials on yoga and acupuncture. However, yoga mostly meant physical exercises and breathing practices in all cases. The spiritual aspects of yoga were mentioned very rarely. Such a position was officially maintained until the end of the 80s. At the same time, there was an active spiritual quest in the private space of Soviet citizens. In the early 70s, it was discovered how, within limits allowed by the regime, one could also openly focus on spiritual yoga practices. A turning point was marked around 70 when psychotherapy became common in Latvia. An autogenic training was applied as one of its methods. The users of this method did not hide the connection of orthogenic training with yoga and meditation practice. Alexander Falkenstein, a psychotherapist at the psychoneurological dispensary, was one of the first practitioners of this method. In one of his interviews, he confirmed, I quote, "Discarding the myth that is in the teaching of yoga, however, we cannot fail to acknowledge the persistence of one method. One of the most effective yoga methods has now been called orthogenic training." Falkenstein and several other psychotherapists were actively involved in promoting the newly discovered method. As with Hatha Yoga exercises, magazines published instructions and techniques for daily orthogenic training. Mass sessions of orthogenic training or mental gymnastics were organized in many places in Latvia. Mental gymnastics could also be studied in several groups. Thus, a good mood club was established and actively operated as a culture house of the Republican Trade Union Council of Latvia. Under Falkenstein's leadership, secondary school and university students participated in the School of Good Name. As a former listener of these school members, young people got their first ideas about meditation and started practicing it during classes of this school. The interest in Eastern philosophy also arose in these classes. Moreover, this interest in Eastern philosophy may have completed a seemingly fundamentally different worldview. The unifying element was the person's progress towards self-improvement, and first of all, the formation of the perfect body. Thus, in the interview published in the late Soviet era magazine Liesma, Fire, a 70-year-old vocational school student said, I quote, "I started attending autogenous training, hypnosis, yoga. I will take care of my body." End quote. From the interview, one can learn that the young man believes in God, but in his own particular way. Is highly interested in Eastern philosophies and plans to study in a Lutheran seminary. Of course, the understanding of meditation was vague, but it was the first step in a more extensive quest. The next step was searching for the appropriate literature, using all the channels available at that time. Most of the knowledge was fragmentary and superficial, but such knowledge also made many enthusiasts want to meditate actively. Therefore, when the first yoga meditation teachers came from the West to Latvia at the end of the 80s, they were met by many enthusiasts who had learned meditation in an autodidactic manner. However, the Eastern religions could be taught in the language of Aesop, which through the innocent stories or activities contain a concealed meaning to inform people or people who wanted to know something more about Eastern religions. One such hidden form of spiritual teaching was related to the growing popularity of Eastern martial arts in the early 70s. Articles on karate appeared in the periodicals, mentioning the unique Oriental spirit and the role of Buddhist monks in its spread in Japan. For many, the mention of these facts was a catalyst for seeking additional information and familiarization with Buddhism in general and Zen Buddhism. Thus, who started participating in these martial arts training could learn even more about Buddhism. The second interesting case is related to the considerable enthusiasm of Latvian society regarding Ikebana. Vladimir Kalva was a professional gardener, traveler, photographer, and also poet. After studying with his masters of Ikebana Soviet School in Moscow at the end of the 60s, he used the Japanese flower arranging tradition with its Buddhist symbols to delve into the themes essential for the people who visited the exhibitions of his flower arrangements. And he has been organizing these exhibitions since 1965. He has also participated in different international exhibitions, and the World Flower Exhibition in Paris was among them. Around 70, Kalva began lecturing on creating flower arrangements, and in later years, from the beginning of the 80s, flower arranging courses were held under his leadership. In 1975, Kalva's book, Poetry of Flowers, was published. Describing the history of Ikebana, Kalva referred to the Buddhist ritual of sacrificing flowers in front of the image of Buddha. In this way, Kalva seamlessly introduced the reader and his students to the spiritual world of Buddhism. Until the end of the 80s, Kalva's articles on Ikebana also appeared in periodicals from time to time. And you see on the screen the greetings cards. The first one is Ikebana by Kalva. Then you'll see typical Soviet greeting cards, Novim Godam. And the third one, I put like an illustration for the search of new spiritual aesthetics, even in greeting cards, closely connected to spirituality from the East. So, new aesthetics of the greeting card. After 1984, the situation began to change rapidly, and interest in Buddhism could already be expressed openly. Articles about Buddhism as spiritual teaching appeared in the press more often. In 1984, a series of lectures, Indian Culture and Literature, was taken with great enthusiasm. And one of the most attended lectures was devoted to the symbolism of Buddhism in Tibetan art. And so in 80s, the ground was prepared for the acceptance of Tibetan Buddhism in Latvia. And now, among all Buddhist groups in Latvia, the most popular and most visible and the most strong are exactly Tibetan Buddhist groups. In 1985, the newspaper Cīņa, Struggle, Communist, the main communist newspaper in Latvia, began to publish travel notes about Altai Mountains in several continuations. Short fragments of this article were devoted to the history of Tibetan Buddhism. There was no negativity in these lines. It was an indication that the time of bans was coming to an end. The fact that interest in the East was politically permissible gave these seekers more room for maneuver and the conviction that, in essence, they were not doing anything illegal, as their quests were more personally oriented and not openly against the Soviet regime and its regulations. The research problem is whether this underground can be evaluated according to the same criteria as evaluating the political underground. No documents have been found confirming that security authorities have persecuted these groups. Also, these authorities were probably well informed of their existence. In response to the growing interest in Eastern religions, the Soviet regime imposed strict limitations regulating in which teaching such interest was permissible and did not harm Soviet ideology in life. The group of Sai Baba students in Latvia, which in 60s and 80s functioned as an underground group, became an environment for complex polyphonic dialogue of various esoteric and religious traditions. In the atmosphere of those years, the spiritual searches of people who belonged to this group included more than just an interest in Vedic tradition. The interest in Eastern spirituality was also filled with other ideas, which gained unprecedented popularity during the hippie movement and its subculture. Fragmentary knowledge of the Indian teachings coexisted peacefully with the ideas of esotericism, particularly theosophy. The cases mentioned in this lecture shows that spiritual quests were not public. We can conclude that they formed the spiritual undergrowth. However, it was not withdrawal or isolation from Soviet reality. It was just a parallel life. According to memoirs and interviews published in journals of the 80s and 90s, this life was often not revealed outward and undisturbedly coexisted with the Soviet life and norms. When spiritual quests were too visible and reached beyond the private area, Soviet authorities attempted to restrict them, which in the late 80s already proved impossible. So we can see that totalitarian regime was unsuccessful in creating fully obedient human beings with a paralyzed creative and intellectual agency in Soviet Union. On the contrary, the political regime was even stimulating the spiritual search of intellectuals, since they had to find innovative strategies to be able to coexist along the official ideology. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Anita, for this inspiring lecture.